symbol of light, symbol of knowledge, symbol of warmth, symbol of freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith as we gather today to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Happy Sunday. It's July 5th, 2020. Great to see all of you that you could join us this morning via this unique Zoom communication format. Today is our second event in our 2020 Summer Forum Speaker Series. Our second speaker is Ben Winslow. Ben is Fox 13's TV reporter on Utah's Capitol Hill, covering a wide variety of topics that range from politics and government and polygamy and vice and courts. He's been in the news business in Utah for over 20 years and working in radio, newspaper, television, and digital news. Now, Ben has received numerous honors for his reporting, and I'm going to embarrass him briefly here. A very, very prestigious National Edward R. Murrow Award, the Religious News Writers Association Local TV News Report of the Year Award, the Utah Society of Professional Journalists. It's given him its Best Government Reporting Award for coverage of the Utah State Legislature's decision to end a state-run medical marijuana distribution system. And again, Ben has been honored by the Utah Broadcasters Association and Society of Professional Journalists with its Best Government Reporting Award for his coverage of Governor Herbert's negotiations with legislators to effectively ban conversion therapy attempts on LGBTQ children. Readers of the Salt Lake Weekly and Q Salt Lake have named him their best TV reporter for many years. Ben co-hosts Utah Booze News, an alcohol policy podcast covering the state's often confusing and quirky laws. And he's also known for his very active Twitter account, keeping Utahns up to date on very important breaking news. The title of this presentation this morning is How I Report the Daily News, Actions of the Utah State Legislature and Unusual Events in the State of Utah. Ben will speak for approximately 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes, and then we will take 1 minute for the offering. We may be meeting virtually, remotely this morning via Zoom, but we are spiritually meeting within the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. After the offering, Ben will be happy to engage in a lively question and answer period until 11 o'clock. We'll finish right at 11 o'clock. You all know that there is no such thing as a bad question. So if you have questions, please type them into the window and I will read them aloud to our guest speaker this morning. So keep that in mind. But,
welcome, Ben.
Yeah, welcome, Ben. And
well, thank you very much.
Now I'm going to begin with Mark Twain, who was a journalist before he was an author. And Mark Twain said, in the real world, nothing happens at the right place at the right time. It's the job of journalists and historians to correct that. And so I would ask you, why did you become a journalist?
Oh gosh, I think I'm just naturally a curious person. And thank you for the introduction. I do promise to the audience I will not take very long so we can get to as many of your questions as possible. A little bit about myself. I did start really reporting as a full-time news reporter while attending college at Southern Utah University. I worked for what was at the time termed a full-service radio station, which meant that in addition to playing music, we had news and we did sports as well. So we broadcast newscasts several times a day. We broadcast all the local ball games. This was in rural Utah down in Cedar City. The station that I worked for was a heavy metal station. So that's about as unusual as you'd expect it to be in rural Utah. I was also the Southern Utah correspondent for the Salt Lake Tribune, which just meant that I covered whatever happened in that part of the state. Eventually, about the turn of the century, which sounds as weird to say as it is, I eventually moved up to work for KSL Radio, where I produced the morning news and reported. I went to work eventually as a crime and courts reporter for the Deseret News for a number of years before I wound up at Fox 13. And I will say that I spent most of my time doing everything I could, avoiding covering the legislature initially. My then boss insisted that I start covering politics, and I used to jokingly say that with crime reporting, at least I knew who the bad guy was. But Capitol Hill was really intimidating to me, but I started to learn the process of how policy is crafted, and really started to enjoy it, learning about how a bill becomes law and learning about all the ways that people advance policy discussions that really impact everybody. Now, Tim asked me to describe how I do my job. So being Fox 13's Capitol Hill reporter, I spend a lot of time keeping up with the day-to-day operations of government. I pester people all the time. From a number of state agencies, I talk to activists, I talk to advocacy organizations every day, basically, asking what's going on, what's coming up, asking reactions to various policy proposals being advanced by people who are in power. We produce about 10.5 hours of news a day on Fox 13. So I pop up onto our daily newscasts several times a day, usually, depending on what's going on. This is a really fun job. I really do enjoy it. Every day seems to be different, which is exciting and challenging. I meet new people all the time. I try to share a variety of perspectives on various issues so that people can make up their own minds about, whether this is good or bad policy for the people of Utah. I've been very fortunate to bear witness to some very historic events in our community. You quoted Mark Twain earlier. I'll also throw out there that, there's also the saying, journalism truly is the first draft of history. And this is one thing that I do find kind of interesting is people, it's kind of funny, people tend to dismiss government reporting as boring news. And it's, people tend to roll their eyes, not pay too much attention, but now it's becoming one of the more important things to cover. I think even those with passing interest now realize that government reporting is critical. It can do a lot of things, as we found in recent months. It can decide whether businesses open or close. It can decide whether people wear face coverings in public or not. And of course, how our overall response to a pandemic is handled. And it's just interesting to see a lot more people really engaged and involved in finding out how their government works and responding to it. Beyond COVID-19, we've certainly had a very busy couple of years on Capitol Hill. We've had ballot initiatives, we've had legislative sessions that have passed significant policy proposals. We've had elections, we've had demonstrations, and let's not forget, we also had an earthquake and 2,400 aftershocks. So, I am not alone on Capitol Hill. There is a small but dedicated Capitol press corps comprised of reporters from the two largest daily newspapers, the Associated Press. There's the National Public Radio affiliate and some political websites. But I will say that I am now, at least as of this year so far, the only full-time television reporter dedicated to Capitol Hill. And like my colleagues, my job is to ask questions of those who make the policy decisions, the people that you elect. So I imagine you want to know why they're making the decisions that they are. I'm a local news reporter, which means that I tend to stay to state and municipal governments. One of my colleagues at Channel 13 keeps an eye on the congressional delegation and handles that aspect of things. And like a lot of areas of journalism, you hear about journalism being impacted significantly by a lot of recent events, and we have too. Viewership is at an all-time high. Advertising, which pays the bills, has dwindled, as certainly you've seen the economy, feel the impact of the pandemic. We're also facing continual challenges with misinformation, disinformation, and of course, criticism of what is termed fake news. My station that I work for, Fox 13, we are a Fox affiliate, which means we air, primetime programming from Fox. But we are owned by the EW Scripps Company, which is a 143-year history of journalism under their belt. They have a motto that I really like, which is give light and the people will find their own way. And I think it is very appropriate for these times. They've been very supportive of us, and you might know them also for the big event that they put on every year, which is the Scripps National Spelling Bee. And before I wrap up, these are my prepared remarks. I'd like to impart a plea to you. It's more important than ever to know what is happening in your community. Journalism has certainly faced a lot of pressures and challenges lately. So please continue to support your local reporters and their newspapers, radio stations, and TV stations. Watch our newscasts, subscribe to your local newspaper, listen and support public radio. We're in your community. We're keeping you informed about what's happening in your community. So that's kind of a broad overview of my job. Hopefully that's kind of what you were looking for, and I'm happy and looking forward to taking questions.
Do you have a role model? When you first entered journalism, about 1997 or so, did you have someone in mind that would be a role model for you?
I've been fortunate to have a lot of role models in my life, people that I've looked up to, people that have helped me. I think of my teachers. I was on my high school newspaper staff, and I had an instructor, and she really taught me to ask critical questions. I also had a history teacher in junior high that I stayed in touch with, and she taught me to always be curious, to always research, to look into things. I've been fortunate. I've had, bosses that I think have challenged me and, pushed me to do better. And to continually keep working. And then of course there's professional role models. There's even colleagues that I work with on Capitol Hill that I admire that have, really great interviewing skills or have the ability to elicit really good answers from people by asking insightful questions. People that I learn from all the time. And I would say it's very fluid. I mean, there's some people who definitely stand out, but I would say I'm always impressed and learning from people all the time.
Okay, good. In reporting a breaking news story, how do you work within the time restrictions?
It's not easy. And there's a lot of times where, you'll note this, that the information changes as the situation evolves. And, a lot of times it's a mad dash to get as much information as you possibly can, and trying to, get it on the air or on digital platforms to convey it to people because they want to hear it, and they want to see it and want to know more information. There's a lot of times that we just have to say, this is what we know and this is what we don't know, and go from there. We certainly try. It's just, there's the constraints, especially nowadays. We are very much in an on-demand society. The answer is always now. And, sometimes it takes a while for things to develop.
Okay. Have you ever had the problem of becoming involved with the story personally as a participant? And if so, how do you govern yourself in that situation?
A little bit, not a lot. I've had some instances where I've been dragged into a big part of a story, but a lot of times, you do have to detach yourself somewhat, and you have to view things, kind of from that 50,000 foot level, which is difficult sometimes. But you try, and you try to present things fairly, and you try to, give your audience, give the people who are reading, listening, watching, all perspectives of what's going on. But, on the few instances that I have, sometimes we do have to, if there's like an ethical issue or things like that, our traditional practice is someone else usually ends up covering it. If our superiors deem it as one of those situations where, perhaps somebody else should cover it because you may be too close to something.
Okay.
If I've answered that correctly, or satisfactorily.
Okay. We're coming up on 20 minutes after the hour. Let's call time out for 1 minute, and we're going to take this time to have the offering. And because we may be meeting virtually, remotely, via Zoom, but we are spiritually within the First Unitarian Church. So let's take 1 minute for the offering, and then we'll come back with questions. Okay.
Hi, we just want to make a couple announcements. The link to coffee hour will be posted in the chat. I'll do that in a few minutes. So before the end of this event, you can get to coffee hour starting at 11. Like last week, we'll have some time in small groups and then have a larger discussion to check in, see how people are doing, talk about what you learned from Ben, just have a conversation. Also, I want to mention that the video recording from last week's summer forum has been posted on YouTube, and it is, you should have received, if you were registered last week, you should have gotten an email on Friday morning saying that the recording was posted and it gave you the link. You will be receiving a link to each of the summer forum video recordings each week, 3 to 4 days following Sunday. So maybe Thursday or Friday, you should be receiving the link next week for Ben Winslow. And so that we'll continue with that every week. If you do not want to receive those messages, it's easy for you to cancel at the bottom of the email. And that's way you can share these videos with your friends or people who didn't get to see it, or you can watch it again. So we're going to be doing that every week.
Okay.
So Tim, go
Good.
ahead for
Okay.
Q&A.
Then a good reporter has good sources. How do you protect your confidential sources?
You know, to the death, pretty much. Yeah, you really do, and there are times when you need to rely particularly on, say, what's termed anonymous sources, and that's a big discussion that we have. There are people who I talk to who give me information that aren't necessarily, it's not for attribution and it's not for publication, it's more for informational, so that I know where to start talking to get people on the record. And that's ideal. In journalism, you want people on the record, and I'm very much a proponent of that. I usually argue that, it's television. I need you to say something on camera to do that. And but there are times when you do have to rely on sources for sensitivity reasons, for informational purposes, that kind of thing. And that's a big discussion that we have at our station about whether or not it's worth, whether we want to rely on an anonymous source as an informational purpose. And that's a big ethical discussion as well. And you've seen that certainly play out on a national level. But for us, I tend to push people to be on the record. I have them do that. But, and so it's very rare that we ultimately rely upon sources who we grant anonymity and then quote, in a publication or on broadcast that way. But it's not without a heavy discussion, because again, the preference is always on the record. But there are certainly other levels of people that I talk to who, give me information and then refer me to, or I can go and find someone who will speak on the record confirming that or, denying it or whatever the case may be.
Okay. To follow up on that, you used that phrase ethical issues, and I see a question from Bonnie in the chat room. What are the top ethical principles that reporters live by or should live by?
There's a number of guides that we use, especially now, because you do have to conduct yourself ethically and fairly. And a few guides that I recommend for people to check out. The Society of Professional Journalists has a code of ethics. They've been around for more than 100 years, and they're, if not 100 years, very close to 100 years. And it's a very good one as far as their code of ethics. And of course, I'm blanking as you're saying this, or as you're asking me this, exactly some of the tenets. Well, but that's a big one that I like. And then the other one is the Radio, Television, Digital News Association has another code of ethics. In fact, let me see if I can look that up really quickly to give you a little bit of a sense of let's see, SPJ Code of Ethics. Here it is. To give you a sense of how we do things. Seek truth and report it is a big one. Taking responsibility for the accuracy of your work, verifying before releasing it, providing context, being cautious when making promises, but keeping promises you make, identifying sources clearly. The public is entitled to as much information as possible to judge the reliability and motivations of sources. Going back to the earlier question, considering sources' motives before promising anonymity, reserving anonymity for sources who may face danger, retribution, or other harm, but have information that cannot be obtained elsewhere, explaining why anonymity is granted, diligently seeking subjects of news coverage to allow them to respond to criticism or allegations of wrongdoing, being vigilant, courageous about holding those in power accountable, giving voice to the voiceless, supporting the open and civil exchange of views, even views that people may find repugnant, recognizing a special obligation to serve as watchdogs over public affairs and government, seeking to ensure that the public's business is conducted in the open and that public records are open to all. And then I'm going to scroll down a little bit more, labeling, advocacy, and commentary. Minimizing harm is another big one that becomes a big topic of debate as well. Balancing the public's need for information against potential harm or discomfort, showing compassion for those who may be affected by news coverage, recognizing legal access to information differs from an ethical justification to publish or broadcast, balancing a suspect's right to a fair trial with the public's right to know, considering the long-term implications of the extended reach and permanence of publication, acting independently is another one, being wary of sources offering information or favors or money. We don't pay for access to news. That's something worth definitely pointing out. Distinguishing news from advertising, being accountable and transparent. That's some of the SPJ's code of ethics to give you an idea of a little of the tenets that we abide by. It's not a hard and fast rule at all times. It's not an absolute. Even the SPJ and the RTDNA acknowledge these things, but they're definitely guides for our profession.
Okay, great. You mentioned that word truth. And I'm thinking again, Mark Twain said that if you tell the truth, then you don't have to remember anything. And I'm just wondering, have you ever been told to go easy on a story here in Utah, maybe something pertaining to the LDS Church or to the Utah State Legislature?
I would say that, certainly there's pressure occasionally to do those things, but I don't think that, I have pulled punches or anything like that. I'd like to think that I have not, but I think it's up to the reader viewer to ultimately decide that.
Okay. Adlai Stevenson ran against Eisenhower twice in the 50s, and he said, journalists do not live by words alone, although sometimes they have to eat them. Have you ever felt like there was a story that you wish you hadn't reported?
I think there's definitely times when we've gotten things wrong. I think there's times when we may have made a bad call about coverage. But, and that's never fun. Having to issue a correction or a retraction or those kinds of things, they're never fun. Fortunately, those are few and far between. But I think every journalist, no matter the industry or the profession, when you have to issue that correction, it hurts, it stings, it's not good. I certainly haven't liked it when I've had to do it in the past.
Okay. Conversely,
and I think it's a motivation to do better in the future.
Yeah, that's right. Conversely, what story or stories come to mind that you're really proud of in your role of being a professional journalist?
I think the stories that, especially lately, that I have done that I feel very proud of are ones that they do shine that light, and they do call attention to issues that affect a lot of people. I think recently, just covering some of the discussions about the medical cannabis ballot initiative and the issues there, showing people how their government works. I think a lot of people passed those initiatives believing that, hey, this is how it's going to be. And then you point out, no, but the legislature, has the power and the authority to change these things, to modify those things, good, bad, or otherwise. But I think, highlighting some of those issues and getting into the nuances of how this very critical policy works. I've done some stories about the difficulties that qualifying patients have had in getting access to this thing that the voters approved and said that they could have, and highlighting some of those disparities, and some of the issues with the policies itself. I've been very proud of those. Some of the stories are ones that just you highlight a problem, and policymakers make a change based upon these, some of the problems that you've been able to highlight. Some of the societal issues you can do. You mentioned another one that was a big deal, was the conversion therapy ban. That one recently was one where you could show how government works. Also, there were obviously people who had strong feelings on all sides of this issue. And by showing, that where the legislature failed, the governor struck some bargains and essentially pushed it through as an administrative rule, and explaining to people, how their government works and how this is possible. I think those are the ones that I feel very proud of, that you can show these things, calling attention to abuses within the system, calling attention to abuses in society. Those are ones that I think we all, especially when they can lead to positive change, I think those are ones that any reporter, myself included, feel very proud of.
You mentioned the legislature and policymakers. I have a question from Colleen. Would you say that Utah politicians are in general representing the voters well, or are they representing their campaign contributors more so?
I think a lot of it, I think that's a fair question. And I think that's a question we ask all the time and we look into a lot, is, who contributes, because contributions do often equal access. I think one thing it also shows is that there's not a lot of level engagement from the public as well. I like to do this all the time, as I ask when people talk about, they find out that I work on Capitol Hill, they ask, oh, what's that like? Or they have a feelings on what's going on. But I like to say, well, do you know who your lawmaker is? Do you know who your representative and your senator is? And a lot of them, I'm very surprised at how many people actually don't. And so I usually try to help them look up who it is. And I'm like, feel free to reach out. They're very responsive. I do believe that a lot of policymakers go in with the best of intentions and the best of, they don't, I don't think they wake up and say, how am I going to screw over the people of Utah today? I think that they genuinely believe that their policy ideas are what is best for the people of Utah. And the push and pull is that other people on Capitol Hill or advocacy groups or activists or voters in general have maybe differing views. And, what we see is, you start with a policy proposal, somebody else adds on, and you eventually make the sausage, as it were, and you see what the finished product looks like. So I think that people engagement actually influences policy. So to answer your question, I think it's a very valid question about whether they listen more to the voters or whether they listen to campaign contributors. Certainly a check gets attention, but I think it's also, I have seen them be very responsive to constituents, particularly constituents who are engaged, who are not afraid to pick up the phone or send a personalized email to their elected lawmaker and say, this is how I feel about this policy. I've seen them be very responsive.
Okay. Here's a question about the inland port. It's from Lee Stanhope.
A very hot topic, yes.
Indeed. And he says, how did you report the founding of the inland port passed in the legislature on the last night of the legislature in 2018, therefore avoiding any commentary period? How do you report both sides of this controversial issue?
I think we try to reach out to as many voices as we can. And this gets back to, some of a little bit of the breaking news thing. Sometimes you have a limited amount of time, but we've certainly tried. And you're right, this came down very last minute. This kind of, in the last few days of the session, there were whisperings that this was going to happen. And then it happened. And what you do is, what we did is, of course, we're in the Capitol, we run up to the lawmakers running this, and we cover the hearings that there are there, and try to get a response from policymakers as well as advocacy groups. You think of some of the environmental groups that have been around, some of the representatives of some of the West Side communities who are most impacted by this. And try to get their response and try to show it to the public at large, a statewide audience that we reach, explaining to them what this does, what this is, how it works. And we've followed up. We've done a number of stories on that. I went to Kansas, where I went to an inland port and talked to people there. And, how do you feel about this? Is this good? Is this bad? We talked to people who were building the inland port in Kansas, who run the inland port in Kansas. We also talked to environmentalists and local residents about how they felt about this, to kind of show people in Utah, this is what's coming or what could be coming, and this is, what it's like. A big distinction, I want to be clear, the story that we did where we traveled to Kansas was, Kansas is wide open and flat. And while there were a lot of concerns about pollution, Utah is unique because we have the bowl, the valley, and you got mountains that act as at both sides. And even the people who were running the inland port in Kansas had made that remark that, you need, there are special environmental considerations for Utah that's a little different than the inland port project that they had in Kansas. But yeah, we certainly have been following up. We've been covering the demonstrations. We've been keeping an eye on the meetings that that have been taking place. I have not, I will be honest, I've not kept as close tabs on the meetings lately, because the coronavirus and the government response to that has been almost all encompassing. But we certainly are watching it, and and I think we will continue to cover it. Not just myself, but I know that my colleagues in newspaper and in other television stations and in radio stations are continuing to watch this, because it is a big project that I think people really do need to pay attention to.
Okay, you mentioned talking to politicians, and Mark Rothecker says, Ben, how do you handle it when you know a politician is lying or is distorting in a major way? If you challenge them too aggressively, you may find it hard to get future interviews. If you let them lie or the distortion to pass, you're doing a disservice to your viewers. Where's the balance?
I think, it is incumbent upon us to push back. I think there's definitely ways of pushing back. I tend to be a little more I don't necessarily get into shout fests with people. That's not typically my style, but I will, push back and I will fact check, on that type of thing. I think people tend to view it as if you're not screaming at someone's face, you're not necessarily, challenging them. No, I think there are different ways of challenging people. And I do try, especially where, if someone is saying something that I know is factually incorrect, you do try to correct them, or at least, let your viewers know that, this is the facts, this is what we know, and this is what we've been told.
You mentioned the coronavirus and the concerns here in Utah as well as nationwide. How do you interpret this issue, this ongoing issue about to wear a mask or not to wear a mask? The concern for public health versus public wealth. How do you handle that as a reporter? Ongoing concern.
Well, what we've done is we have tried to show this is what health experts are recommending. This is what the governor is recommending. This is what leading policymakers dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, even businesses and business leaders are recommending this. And you try to provide that context and let people know this is why they're making these decisions. Yes, there are people who certainly have a contrary viewpoint who don't necessarily believe that, and you can include that. But we do try to, at least provide the proper context. And this is why they believe that this is good policy, that they believe that the efficacy of wearing a face covering in public can cut the rate of transmission down. And that, you have businesses. One thing I've had to do lately is point out that businesses do have the right to refuse service to anybody who doesn't wear a mask, regardless of whether there's a mandate or not. And the Salt Lake Chamber has said we will back any business in the state that does not do this, and the governor has said that as well. But that's kind of how we do that. Is we try to provide the proper context to explain to viewers, to explain to readers, to explain to listeners why policymakers believe this is a good decision. It is ultimately up to people at the end of the day to decide whether or not they choose to accept that or not.
Here is a controversial question given your listening audience, who I suspect most of them are daily NPR listeners.
Okay.
And, I suspect they have a certain perspective or view with regard to National Fox News. And yet
Yes.
Here we're talking Channel 13 here in Salt Lake City. Could you explain the distinction? Several questions come about the distinction between Fox 13 in Salt Lake City and the National Fox Network with regard to political and governmental public policy issues and ownership.
Certainly. Certainly. So as I mentioned earlier, we're actually owned by the EW Scripps Company. And so we are not owned by Fox, the Fox Broadcasting Company. We are a Fox affiliate, which means we carry primetime programming for Fox. We have more in common with Tina Belcher than we do with Tucker Carlson. So, we carry Fox primetime programming, which means we carry shows like WWE, NASCAR, Bob's Burgers, The Simpsons, that type of programming. We don't actually take the Fox News Channel like primetime programming. And so just to answer that question, we do on occasion take the network feed when it is like a presidential news conference, when it is like, the State of the Union address, that type of thing. But that's done by their news division, which is different than their primetime programming, which tends to be the opinion, the editorial. Similarly, you could argue, similar to a newspaper's news pages and an opinion page in a newspaper, if I can make some kind of a comparison for people to kind of, understand that. But we're an affiliate in the sense of like, like KSL would be an NBC affiliate. They're not MSNBC, but they do take NBC programming. ABC, Channel 4, Channel 2 is CBS. Just to give you an idea, it's the primetime programming that you run.
Okay.
The newsrooms are entirely separate from all of that.
Okay. Question comes up with regard to the current occupant in the White House and his almost daily access to national Fox News. Does local Fox 13 utilize any of those feeds that come from the national affiliation with regard to the current president?
With regard to the president, I mean, we would air an interview the same way that CNN does as well. And we are also a CNN affiliate, which means that we get CNN's news coverage as well. And so you would, in the sense that, you know, the president says this, and that's what you have is it's the same that ABC gets, that CBS would get, that NBC would get. Is there the remarks by the president that are newsworthy do filter down into local broadcasts, if that makes sense.
Okay. A news judgment question.
Mm-hmm.
How would you define breaking news? It seems to me that on the half hour to the hour, whether it's CNN or MSNBC or it's Fox, that we'll get the large graphic on the screen that says breaking news. And then one wonders, is this really significant to get our attention? But yet it does get our attention at the beginning of the half hour or the hour. Does Channel 13
I think we do. We do, like a lot of stations do. We tend to, there's a big distinction, I think, between local and national news. Local, we tend to view it as what is happening now, or what is happening in the very recent past, that people need to know about. Nationally, I have noticed in the times that I do watch cable news, is that it does tend to be like, yeah, that broke like 8 hours ago. You know, I think local news tends to take a more of an urgency and immediacy thing versus nationally. But you know, some of these things, I think people, it's a judgment call. I think it is a judgment call made above my level on these things. But I think you will see that breaking news, I think it tends to be applied to things that are more urgent and immediate on a local level. I can't speak to the decision making for a cable news channel or why they would do some of these things on the network level.
Well, back to the local level and with you, I see a question here from Ross that says, you're famous for using a Twitter account to keep Utahns informed about what's going on. Can you explain how you learned to perfect that social medium and why it's such a valuable tool for reporters today?
I don't know if it's so much a valuable tool. It is something I kind of adopted. I actually started my Twitter account way back, I believe, when I was at the Deseret News, and it's just kind of stayed with me. It's a way I do it because I think it's a way I both use it as notes now, because if I'm in a meeting, it helps me focus, and you know, and people get a real-time sense. And it's not absolute. It's not necessarily contextual. It doesn't necessarily present, you know, everything that happened in, say, a public meeting. But I spend a lot of time in public meetings. I jokingly say I go to public meetings so you don't have to. But I use it to kind of as a note-taking thing, but also to keep people informed. And Twitter definitely gives people, I think, a real-time sense anymore. This is one of the things about social media, is it gives a real-time sense of what is happening, or as close to real-time as you can get. And you know, it's good. There's good, there's bad about all of these things. But the one thing I would always caution is you know, just because you see it on my Twitter feed, definitely make sure you watch like a broadcast or read the article later to kind of get a more contextualized and clearer sense of what is going on. But I know a lot of people do follow my Twitter account, and they do like to kind of keep an eye on what's going on. And it's sort of an easy way to passively keep an eye on what your government's doing. And it's kind of evolved that way. There's no strategy. I have no grand strategy or anything like that. I'm kind of learning as I go, and, you know, stumbling through it.
Well, another related question dealing with this changing technology is how we're communicating right now via Zoom, remotely, virtually, which is greatly impacting government, politics, the economy, education. How is this technology impacting you and your ability to be able to do your job? Now you don't have to drive halfway through the state and come back to meet somebody. You can communicate this way. How is this impacting you on a daily basis?
So yeah, this is really interesting in the sense of this is a fun little fact about our station. Um, we can't go into our own station because we don't necessarily have the ability to properly socially distance. So when the pandemic hit, we have producers who normally would be in studio all day long, gathering news from various sources, writing the newscasts. They're very talented people, and they now have to work from home. I have to work from home. Occasionally, I get a field trip up to the Capitol for something that's happening up there. But like, I basically, we're all working remotely. This really affected all of us. And I think everybody was forced to pivot to this working from home. It was really funny. Before the pandemic hit, I was doing a few stories about the state experimenting with the idea of teleworking. They had picked a few state employees and were like, you get to work from home. Let's see how this works out. We're going to do a big study and then we'll see if we can advance this. Well, the pandemic forced everybody to work from home. And we're seeing it's working in private industry and in government industry. Not absolute, not for everybody, but we're certainly seeing that. It's helped me, actually. I know that a lot of my colleagues at Channel 13 have been impacted. They don't, necessarily have the ability to go out and see things and talk to people one-on-one, that kind of thing. For me, it's actually helped me. I feel like I have a wider variety of sources. The technology that people have been forced to utilize across the board and across the state means that I'm able to talk to the Grant County Council chair. And she has talked to me about their mask mandates and all of the things that she has been pushing for that very tourist-centric area, the economic impact. I talked to the mayor of St. George about how they feel about closures and things. I feel like it's been able to give me a wider variety of interviews and a wider variety of people to talk to than just, well, I can't drive 4 hours to St. George today, or I can't drive, 3.5 hours to Moab. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to include, your voice in my story as much as I would like to. This has made it a lot easier for me. It's also interesting that since the Capitol's been closed down and a lot of our politicians are, shall we say, in the higher risk categories, they don't want to meet with me one-on-one, even socially distant now. They prefer Zoom. And I've also noticed it's easier to get people because a lot of people have it on their phones or they have their laptop with them. Mayor Wilson, I've talked to her many times over Zoom. And it's one of those things that, you could say, well, they have time, they have like 5 minutes, at about, 12:30 in the afternoon or something like that. And you can get them, and include them in your story without necessarily having to play this game of, well, what's your schedule like? And what's your schedule like? And where can I meet you? And, how can we do this? It does speed things up. And I would say add to a wider variety of sources. It's not the same as going out though and witnessing what's going on to get the sense of what's happening. We've found you obviously cannot cover a downtown demonstration via Zoom. You have to physically be there. And there are some things that you do miss, that ability to look and get that 360-degree view, because the view that you only have is, this window right here.
Okay. You've worked in print journalism. You've worked in radio, now with Fox 13. How do you feel about this phrase, if it bleeds, it leads?
It's an old phrase that goes back to, I believe, print days. And yeah, I'm personally not a fan of it. I've become the government reporter where I'm like, this is really important. This affects everybody in the state. that type of thing. I recognize, the balance that you have of urgency and the balance that you have of, things happening now, with that type of argument. I think if it bleeds, it leads tends to be a bit of a pejorative, and I think it was designed to be that way. I do tend to personally, given the area that I spend the bulk of my days covering, I'm one of those people that's more of the wonky policy level type.
Okay. We have reporters who are very young, just out of college, and sometimes there's the perception that they don't have a great breadth of knowledge of history or governmental structure. Young reporters, when they're hired, say by Fox 13, is there any type of orientation or preparation to going to school in terms of how, especially if they were not journalism majors, and yet now they've been hired? How does, say, Fox 13 handle that situation with new journalists?
I think we try to, provide as much as we can. There's also resources where people can reach out. I mean, I do a lot to try to explain to people the process, especially, if they are new, young, and they don't necessarily know the nuances of, say, state government or municipal government. And remember, every state is different. I would never say that some people are just completely clueless. I would say that, they may have worked in another state where, they have an assembly versus a legislature, or they may have a different style of how their governments, handle things. And, you think even locally here, we have commissions and councils and how that all works, and each one is different. And I'm still learning. And I've been doing this for 20 plus years. I'm still learning. I think a lot of it is also experience. The more you do this, the more you learn. I do wish that more schools and there would be more of a focus on civics and civic education, just so that people do have more of a better sense of it. But I do say that we do try to provide some kind of resources, at least, for people who, especially if they're thrown onto a story that they don't necessarily always cover. I tend to stick to Capitol Hill, so I'm very, very familiar with it. My colleagues that occasionally join me up on Capitol Hill, I try to help them out as much as I can and explain to them, this is the policy or this is the process. When a bill passes the Senate, it doesn't mean that it's passed and it's law. It still has to go over to the House, or it still has to go to the governor for his signature or veto. And then let's not even get into when it's amended and then it has to go back to the chamber. Let's not even get into those sticky details of how a bill becomes a law. Kind of keep it the broad strokes, but it is something that we try to, I try to at least help out.
We just had a primary election, June 30th for governor, other elections as well. We're 4 months away from the presidential election as well. How do you do your job given this virus and reconciling it with the technology we have?
We're learning by doing. Really, we are, like all of you, we are trying to find our way in the dark here. And it's changed everything. There's no longer campaign rallies on a local level. There's no longer, the parades. I mean, who knew that the honkin' wave would make a comeback as a legitimate form of campaigning, because you could be socially distant. But we're all learning. I think this is going to be the overarching policy discussion for going into November, both on a national level and a local level. I think because it is all encompassing to everybody's lives. This virus is impacting everybody from an economic level to a public health level. It's just, I think it's one of those things that it's going to be a big issue that's going to continue. And, I think it's going to definitely shift how people campaign, how voters interact with candidates, how voters evaluate, even right down to how we vote. I mean, just fun fact, Utah's been vote by mail for years, as we all know. But this year was the first year that a lot of counties did away with any form of in-person voting because of the safety reasons. The ballots, why it's taken so long to get results is the ballots have been quarantined for 24 hours.
That's right.
Just as a safety precaution. Like it's changing everything.
That's right. Indeed, that's been a surprise for you. We're almost out of time. Looking in doing your job, what has been the continual surprise, the continual daily surprise?
Oh, I continually surprised. I don't know. I think that what I really am always surprised at is how different, even though, I mean, we jokingly say that with coronavirus lately, it's Groundhog Day. Every day is the same, is the same. It's still slightly different. And I still love my job because I do get a chance to talk to people and meet people and, you know, inform the public about really important issues that affect them. You know, tax reform was a thing earlier this year. Coronavirus is a thing now. We have demonstrations against, you know, racial inequality and for, you know, changes in societal justice. You know, all of this is, every day is different, and that's why I love it. And so I would just, you know, in closing, really impart to people, you know, support your local journalists. We are in your community. We're covering the issues. You know, don't be afraid to tell us when we do wrong. Don't be afraid to tell us when we do right.
Okay. Then we're coming up on 11 o'clock. I want to thank you. I want to thank you very much for being our second speaker in our Summer Forum Speaker Series. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for what you do. What you do is so very important for our ongoing experiment in democracy. Thank you.
Thanks.
And as we close, just a quick reminder about next week, July 12th, Michelle Quist from the Salt Lake Tribune will be our third Summer Forum speaker. Michelle is a columnist, as you know, for the Salt Lake Tribune, a lawyer also, a past political candidate, and also a very busy mom. The title of Michelle's presentation is How I Do It, to be a columnist for the Tribune, an activist, and a single parent mom. And so please join us next week for July 12th. Please join us also for the upcoming coffee hour that we will have. And to please stay healthy, please stay safe. And I'm going to turn around and I'm going to blow out the candle and the chalice. Please be well. Thank you so very much for attending.